The name Donald Fagan has always carried weight in the music world. As co-founder of Steely Dan, he was celebrated as a genius, an artist obsessed with precision, whose songs blended smooth sophistication with lyrics that hinted at darkness beneath. But outside the studio, his personal life was almost aggressively private. He lived not in the glare of celebrity, but in a mansion tucked away behind iron gates, a fortress of solitude that seemed to grow more enigmatic with every passing year. Neighbors whispered about odd deliveries, flickering lights, and sounds that drifted into the night long after the world had gone to sleep. The mansion became a riddle no one could solve. And when investigators were finally granted access, what they found didn't just surprise them, it left them speechless. The question is, what could a man so dedicated to perfection have been hiding within his walls? Stay tuned and find out. Donald Fagan's mansion was older than his fame. Built in the late 19th century by a shipping magnate who craved grandeur, it was a Gothic revival sprawl of arches, ivy, and stone that seemed to loom rather than welcome. By the time Fagan acquired it in the 1980s, he was already notorious for his perfectionism in the studio. To him, the house was more than an address. It was a retreat, a container for his compulsions, a place where the outside world could not intrude. At first, the mansion appeared ordinary in its wealth. The gardens were sculpted, the driveway pristine, the gates imposing but tasteful. Yet even in those early years, visitors remarked on something off-kilter about the interior. Rooms didn't just look curated, they looked staged, as though Fagan wanted every object to perform a role. Records weren't simply shelved, but organized by year, label, and sometimes even by engineer. Musical instruments were polished to gleam, positioned in precise geometries across studio floors. Still, entire wings were closed off. Some doors were bolted from the inside. Curtains were drawn over hallways no guest was allowed to enter. Few ever saw more than the front rooms, and those who did spoke later in vague terms, mentioning corridors that bent in directions the exterior footprint couldn't explain, or storage areas where stacks of unmarked boxes reached nearly to the ceiling. By the 2000s, the mansion had shifted from home to fortress. Gardeners were dismissed, vines crawled unchecked, and the driveway darkened with neglect. Yet the house was never silent. Locals noticed windows glowing at odd hours, sometimes with the steady warmth of lamps, other times with sharp pulses of light that suggested machinery hidden deep inside. Trucks arrived long after midnight, unloading equipment too heavy for a single man. The parcels never carried shipping labels, and no one ever saw who collected them. In time, the estate became more myth than house. Children called it haunted, daring each other to touch its gates. Adults speculated it was simply the eccentricity of a brilliant but reclusive musician. But those who knew Fagan's reputation in the studio suspected otherwise. This was not a man who tolerated imperfection. If the mansion had become a labyrinth, then every wall, every lock, every hidden corridor had a purpose. And as investigators would later learn, that purpose was far darker than anyone outside could guess. The first stories came from neighbors. In the dead of night, when the street lay still, faint piano notes spilled from the mansion. They weren't melodies, they were fragments, obsessive loops of a phrase repeated over and over before cutting abruptly to silence. Other nights brought muffled voices, not conversations, but rehearsals, as though Fagen, or someone else, was speaking to an audience only he could see. Delivery drivers added their accounts. Packages were left at the gate with strict instructions never to ring or knock. Minutes later, they'd vanish, though no one ever spotted who retrieved them. One driver swore he heard heavy chains clanking just beyond the hedges, as though something was being dragged across stone. Another claimed he glimpsed a figure standing in the upstairs window at 3 a.m., staring down at him, unmoving until he drove away. Children, daring each other, crept close to the gates. Some said the air grew colder the nearer they stepped. Others swore they heard whispers that seemed to come from the ivy itself. The stories spread quickly, that the mansion was haunted, that Fagen kept a vault of unreleased recordings guarded like treasure, that rooms inside shifted when no one was looking. Adults dismissed the tales as neighborhood gossip, but their own observations troubled them. The power grid spiked whenever the house lit up at night, as though some vast system within demanded more electricity than the block could comfortably supply. Strange humming noises carried through the still air, sometimes mechanical, sometimes almost organic. And always, there was the sense that the mansion was not sleeping, but waiting. Inside, the few who had entered spoke cautiously. They described long hallways with shadows that seemed to move ahead of them, paintings with eyes that followed a beat too long, rooms where the acoustics bent sound strangely, making whispers echo as if shouted. No one was ever left alone. Even guests close to Fagen admitted being escorted firmly away if they stepped near bolted doors. The whispers and shadows became legend, but to those who lived nearby, they were too consistent to ignore. This wasn't just the eccentricity of a famous musician. The mansion was guarding something, and its silence had begun to feel like a warning. To understand the mansion, one must first understand Donald Fagan. In the studio, he was relentless. Session musicians recalled playing the same bar of music hundreds of times, only to be dismissed when their feel wasn't quite right. Fagan didn't just demand perfection, he demanded control. And that same compulsion shaped his home. Visitors described his collections, shelves stacked with reel-to-reel tapes, many unlabeled, cabinets filled with notebooks of cramped handwriting, dates, times, initials that didn't match known collaborators. One friend recalled a corridor where the walls were lined with metronomes, all ticking at slightly different speeds, creating a maddening, syncopated rhythm. Another described rooms where instruments were positioned as if waiting for a performance, but no one ever played them. Whole wings of the mansion were off-limits. Heavy bolts sealed doors. Windows had been bricked over from the inside. In one instance, a contractor hired for electrical work claimed he was led through 3 separate locked doors before reaching the panel, each door fitted with newer locks than the last, as if layers of secrecy had been built over decades. What was being hidden? Some speculated Fagan had turned parts of the mansion into private studios, designed not for recording albums, but for experiments, testing acoustics, isolating frequencies, perhaps even recording things never meant for release. Others believed the house had become an archive of obsession, a labyrinth where every locked room contained another fragment of Fagen's need for order. By the time investigators entered the mansion fully, one thing was clear. This wasn't simply a musician's retreat. It was a structure remade in his image, a place where perfection and secrecy had fused into something unnerving. Donald Fagan hadn't just lived in that house, he had transformed it into the physical manifestation of his inner world. And when the doors were finally opened, what lay inside was far stranger than anyone expected. When the investigators pushed deeper into Donald Fagan's mansion, they realized almost immediately that the structure did not align with its blueprints. Rooms jutted at impossible angles, hallways stretched longer than they should, and staircases led to landings that didn't exist on paper. It was as though the house had been quietly rebuilt from the inside, brick by brick, until it no longer matched its own skin. The first locked door gave way to a library, but this was no ordinary archive. Books had been hollowed out, their spines concealing reels of magnetic tape, folders stuffed with faded Polaroids, and rolls of unmarked film. A wall-sized map stretched across one end of the room, covered in clear plastic and dotted with pins, string linking points across New York, Los Angeles, even overseas. Notes in Fagen's precise hand listed dates, names, and numbers. It looked less like a musician's archive than an intelligence operation. Another locked room revealed something stranger still. Once an upstairs bedroom, it had been transformed into a surveillance chamber. The windows were bricked over, but a narrow slit, just wide enough for an eye, had been cut into the wall overlooking the hall below. Beneath it, vintage monitors blinked faintly, their cords trailing into the floorboards. In the closet, investigators found a crawl space that wound like a vein through the mansion, suggesting someone could move unseen from one end of the house to the other. The third locked chamber unsettled even the most hardened officers. The wallpaper was faded children's designs, balloons, cartoon ships, teddy bears. In the corner sat a crib, draped with a dust-coated sheet. No toys, no life. Only chalk marks scratched along the doorframe, recording growth in uneven notches before halting abruptly at shoulder height. On the floor, a groove carved into the wood revealed someone had paced the same circle endlessly. The emptiness was worse than clutter. It was the absence of a life that might have been. At the end of a damp corridor, investigators found the most impenetrable door yet, steel, matte, and industrial, incongruous with the mansion's vintage wood and stone. A keypad had been installed, its digits worn smooth from use. While waiting for a specialist, officers pried elsewhere, uncovering vents with loose screws, floorboards concealing pouches of objects too personal to dismiss. When the keypad finally yielded, the door opened with a mechanical groan. A staircase descended steeply into the earth, breathing air sharp with chemicals and rust. Whatever Fagen had hidden, it was down there, and the locks suggested it was never meant to be found. The raid was not dramatic at first glance, but its weight grew with each step. By dusk, the mansion was ringed with patrol cars, the cul-de-sac awash in the alternating flash of red and blue. Neighbors pressed behind barricades, whispering, cameras raised, waiting for something to justify years of speculation. When the battering ram struck the great oak doors, the echo rolled across the street like thunder. Inside, the air was heavier. Investigators fanned through the lower levels, cameras clipped to their chests, documenting as they advanced. Parlors stood frozen in time, grand pianos missing keys, portraits with faces scraped down to blank ovals, clocks ticking unevenly, as though marking a rhythm no human heart could follow. What should have been ordinary rooms felt staged, theatrical, deliberately uncanny. Radio chatter snapped through the halls. Secured door here. Possible basement access. Request masks, unidentified odor. A command post formed in the foyer with blueprints spread over a folding table. But almost immediately, officers realized the house had defied its own architecture. Hallways were longer than marked. Rooms curved into spaces that should not exist. Some closets led into others, as though the house was nesting within itself. At 10:14 p.m., the house came alive. Somewhere deep inside, a generator coughed awake. Lights flickered in rooms untouched, while an intercom crackled with static, spitting out fragments of sound, half words, groans, a warped melody. Norman Brown's mansion had felt dead when breached. Donald Fagan's house felt like it was breathing. Two teams split. One traced the hidden crawl spaces, crawling through dust-choked shafts that twisted under floors and behind walls. The other confronted the steel door. The locksmith's drill whined. The lock surrendered. Inside, they found a switchboard, its labels chilling in their precision. Studio A, Observation, Archive. Only one switch glowed faintly. Sub-level pump. Water, or something thicker, was moving below. By midnight, neighbors drifted home, but reporters stayed. The mansion had begun to confess, and no one wanted to miss its words. The air grew sweet and cloying, masks barely shielding against the nausea. The team leader raised a hand. Document everything. Nothing touched without gloves. His voice cracked only once, betraying unease. The staircase at the steel door funneled downward, narrowing with each step. The smell intensified. Bleach, metal, something organic beneath. The walls shimmered with condensation, and at the bottom, their lights revealed a chamber scooped into the earth, bigger than any blueprint allowed. This was no accident of design. This was intent, carved and concealed. And it was waiting. The first impression was order. The underground chamber resembled a laboratory fused with a recording studio. Stainless steel counters gleamed under flashlight beams. Cabinets were labeled, files, samples, masters. A drain split the floor, feeding into a sump that hummed below, pulling moisture through unseen pipes. This was not a dungeon. It was worse. It was deliberate. On one table lay objects laid out with ritual precision. Photographs, concert tickets, handwritten letters. Each was tagged with a date and initials. Not souvenirs, trophies. A wall of reels stretched overhead, each labeled with session times, but many bore cryptic notes. Subject X. Night study. Compliance. They were not song titles. In the center stood what looked like a dentist's chair, bolted to the floor. Straps dangled from its arms. A shelf nearby held headphones, blindfolds, a metronome ticking steadily. The officers exchanged no words, but each understood. They had walked into a place where sound was not art, but control. A back door led to smaller rooms, their air colder. Freezers lined the walls, frost caked on their handles. Inside, vials carefully arranged, labeled not with chemicals, but with initials. Another freezer contained tapes, hundreds of them, stacked like archives. An old reel-to-reel recorder sat ready, as if waiting for the next take. Beyond the freezers, a tunnel sloped downward, walls sweating. Hooks jutted from the sides, empty now but marked by long impressions. At its end, a chamber roughly carved from stone held a rusted cot, a blanket folded with military precision. Even here, the sense of order persisted, as though the chaos was controlled, catalogued, rehearsed. On a scarred wooden table lay a ledger, its spine cracking under the weight of decades. Names filled its pages, paired with dates, cities, cryptic symbols. Some entries bore a red slash beside them. The number of marked names was whispered aloud before silence fell again, heavier than the air itself. Nothing screamed. That was the most chilling part. The horror did not announce itself in chaos. It was quiet, methodical, organized. This was not a place of madness, but of obsession honed into routine. When the call finally went out, radios carried the weight up the staircase and into the night. Outside, the crowd felt the shift before they heard the words. Reporters straightened. Neighbors crossed arms against the sudden chill. Donald Fagan's mansion had revealed its first secret. But deeper questions pressed. Where did the tunnel end? What else lay behind the locked doors? And how long had the music of this house been playing unheard? The basement's first chamber had been chilling enough, but what investigators discovered deeper in the mansion redefined the word obsession. A narrow passageway branched off the main laboratory-like room, leading into a series of chambers that seemed to spiral inward. Each room carried its own theme, its own collection, as though Donald Fagan had compartmentalized different pieces of his compulsion. The first was an archive of sound. Reels of tape stretched wall to wall, stacked in meticulous rows. Most were unmarked, but others bore cryptic designations: Midnight Study, Subject K, Threshold Test, Room B. A few were labeled with dates from the 1980s and 1990s, long after Steely Dan's heyday. When investigators threaded one tape to a portable player, what emerged was not music, but noise. Loops of single piano notes played endlessly. Warped voices repeating phrases. A metronome that ticked unevenly, as if someone had tampered with its mechanism. The effect was nauseating, disorienting, and intentional. These were not rehearsals. They were experiments. The second chamber focused not on sound, but on sight. Shelves of photographs lined the walls, each captured from strange angles. Overhead shots of highways, blurred images of people crossing streets, storefronts at dusk, subway stations at night. The subjects were rarely centered, often caught mid-motion, unposed and unaware. Some images had dates scribbled on the back, others bore initials. A disturbing number of faces appeared again and again, suggesting prolonged surveillance. Investigators realized this was not an artist's photo archive, but a log of observation. The third chamber was perhaps the most unsettling. It resembled a crude museum with glass cases holding ordinary objects: a child's shoe, a half-empty perfume bottle, a leather-bound journal filled only with the words "play" again repeated across pages. Each item was tagged with a code that corresponded to the ledger found earlier. Together, they formed a catalog of lives touched, or perhaps consumed, by whatever Fagen had been constructing here. Pinned to one wall was a massive score sheet. Unlike his famous arrangements, these were not songs, but symbols. Notes bent into unnatural shapes, measures broken by jagged lines, rests stretching into impossible silences. An investigator whispered, "This isn't music. This is something else." The deeper they explored, the clearer the picture became. Fagen's perfectionism, celebrated in the studio, had metastasized into obsession. He hadn't merely built a home studio, he had built a labyrinth where sound and silence were weapons, where people were cataloged like instruments, and where control was the final composition. The archives were not just collections, they were confessions etched in tape, in photographs, in objects meticulously preserved. Every wall, every shelf, every label whispered the same truth. Donald Fagan's genius had been driven into a place no one was meant to follow. And now, for the first time, the world could see it. When news of the mansion's discoveries broke, the neighborhood was quick to confess what they had long suspected. For decades, the house had been the source of whispered stories, but no one had dared to voice them beyond casual gossip. Now, their fragments formed a chilling mosaic. Mrs. Kelly, who lived across the street for 30 years, recalled nights when trucks pulled into the driveway long after midnight. The vehicles were unmarked, their drivers expressionless, unloading crates that took 2 men to carry. "I never saw a delivery company logo, never heard them speak," she said later. The crates went inside, and that was that. Another neighbor, a retired mailman, admitted he handled unusual correspondence for the mansion. Envelopes arrived from overseas, Japan, Germany, Morocco, always marked personal, always picked up directly by Fagen, or an intermediary who avoided conversation. Once, when a package went missing, Fagen appeared in person at the post office, his tone polite, but edged with a coldness that left the staff shaken. Children had their own tales. One boy, now an adult, recounted how he climbed the mansion's wall on a dare. From the rooftop, he glimpsed a dimly lit room where dozens of metronomes ticked in chaotic syncopation. He scrambled down in terror, swearing he'd seen shadows moving against the wall, though no one stood near them. For years afterward, he avoided walking past the property. Others described sounds, humming machinery beneath the ground, sharp metallic clanks, or, on still nights, what sounded like faint cries muffled by walls. Some dismissed these as tricks of imagination. Others carried the certainty that something was deeply wrong within those walls. And yet, no one acted. The mansion was untouchable. Donald Fagan was a figure of power, connected, respected. To accuse him of anything beyond eccentricity seemed unthinkable. It was easier to pretend it was just an odd musician being odd, one neighbor confessed. But deep down, we knew. After the raid, as the truth began to spread, the neighborhood transformed. Homes once worth fortunes lost value overnight. Reporters camped along the sidewalks. Documentaries replayed the neighbors' stories, weaving them into the narrative of the mansion. For those who had lived in its shadow, the revelations carried both relief and guilt. Relief that the secrets were finally exposed. Guilt that they had remained silent, allowing the mansion's myth to grow while its truth festered. The neighbors always knew, but they hadn't wanted to believe. Now, faced with the evidence, they admitted it. The mansion had been alive all along, and they had been its unwilling witnesses. For decades, Donald Fagan's name was synonymous with brilliance. Steely Dan albums topped charts. Critics hailed their sophistication, and fans celebrated their polished sound. But with the revelations of his mansion, that legacy became a question mark. Could one separate the genius of the music from the darkness of its creation? Investigators combed through the archives, trying to draw lines between the tapes, the ledgers, and the world outside. Some reels contained fragments suspiciously similar to motifs found in Steely Dan songs, hauntingly twisted versions of riffs and lyrics that fans knew by heart. Were these early drafts, or something else entirely? One theory suggested that the band's obsession with perfection wasn't confined to the studio, but was merely the visible tip of a much larger compulsion. Fans were torn. Some refused to believe the reports, insisting the discoveries were exaggerated or misinterpreted. Others felt betrayed, hearing new menace in songs they once loved. Lyrics that had seemed witty or ironic now read like confessions. "We are the people who rule the world," once playful, now echoed with menace when paired with the images of the basement chambers. Industry insiders were less surprised. Session musicians whispered that Fagan's perfectionism had always felt like obsession. Some recalled nights when he refused to stop recording until dawn. Others remembered his silence, how he could dismiss a musician with a single look, as though their humanity was irrelevant. Looking back, the mansion explains a lot, one anonymous source admitted. He wasn't just chasing perfection, he was chasing control. The question of legacy extended beyond music. Could the art stand apart from the man? Could brilliance excuse obsession, or did the mansion's revelations taint every note? Scholars debated, critics speculated, fans argued. But the truth was unavoidable. Donald Fagan's life had not been confined to the music. It had spilled into the very structure of his home, and that home had revealed a darkness no record sleeve could hide. In the end, legacy became less about songs and more about questions. Was genius worth the cost? And if so, whose cost was it to bear? By the time the mansion was sealed, catalogued, and photographed, the world had seen enough to know it was no ordinary home. It was a mirror of its owner, a man who built his career on control and carried that need into every wall, every corridor, every hidden chamber. What the mansion revealed was not just eccentricity, it was the architecture of obsession. Sound twisted into experiments, objects catalogued into trophies, spaces warped into labyrinths where logic bent and shadows lingered. It was a world designed not for living, but for keeping secrets, keeping order, keeping control. To some, the revelations destroyed Donald Fagan's image. To others, they deepened the mystery, transforming him from musician into myth. But beyond debates and speculation, the mansion itself remained, a physical reminder of what obsession can build when left unchecked. The house now stands silent, its gates locked, its windows dark. Some demand it be demolished, erased from the earth. Others argue it should remain, a warning carved in stone. For those who once lived in its shadow, the choice hardly matters. The memory of the mansion is burned into them forever. In the end, the most unsettling truth was not what they found inside, but what the mansion said about genius itself. That brilliance and darkness often share the same walls. That perfection, pursued without limits, can become a prison. And that even the most beautiful music can echo from the darkest chambers of the human mind. Donald Fagan's mansion revealed not just his secrets, it revealed ours. Our willingness to idolize genius, to overlook obsession, to let brilliance blind us to the shadows behind it. And when the doors finally opened, when the locks surrendered, the world was left with silence louder than any song. The silence of a house that had finally confessed. The mansion of Donald Fagan may now stand silent, its secrets dragged into the light. But the questions it leaves behind will echo far longer than any chord. Was it the home of a genius chasing perfection, or the prison of a man consumed by obsession? What we know is unsettling. Behind every masterpiece, there may lie shadows we choose not to see. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because there are more stories, more secrets, and more unsettling truths waiting to be uncovered.